David Reeves had always been a deep sleeper, the kind of person who could sleep through fire alarms and thunderstorms with equal ease. So when he began to surface from sleep that Tuesday morning, fighting against the pull of unconsciousness like a drowning man clawing toward light, he knew something was wrong. His apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the city, traffic, sirens, the argumentative couple next door, were absent, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. He tried to open his eyes and found the simple act required more effort than it should. His eyelids felt weighted, his entire body wrapped in warmth that seemed to press down on him from both sides. The thought drifted through his sluggish mind that he must have forgotten to turn down the thermostat again, that he'd piled too many blankets on the bed in his half-asleep state. But the warmth wasn't the suffocating heat of too many covers. It was alive somehow, pulsing gently, and it smelled like nothing he could quite identify. Vanilla, maybe. Or cinnamon. Mixed with something electric, like the air after lightning strikes. His left arm was asleep, pinned under something soft. His right felt similarly trapped. David managed to crack one eye open and immediately shut it again because the light was all wrong. Not too bright, actually perfect, comfortable, but the quality of it felt off, like sunlight filtered through water he couldn't see. "Lyra, I think he's waking." The voice came from his right, feminine and low, with an accent that made English sound like music played on instruments that didn't exist. David's eyes snapped fully open this time, adrenaline doing what willpower couldn't. He found himself staring at a ceiling that shouldn't exist. His apartment ceiling had a water stain shaped vaguely like Australia and a smoke detector with a blinking red light. This ceiling was smooth, seamless, and seemed to glow with its own gentle luminescence. Worse, it was transparent in places, revealing what looked like the depths of space beyond, stars wheeling in patterns he'd never seen, even in his work at the Deep Space Monitoring Station. "Give him a moment, Kayla. The transition is always disorienting." The second voice came from his left, higher, touched with amusement. David's head felt like it was moving through honey as he turned it, first right, then left. Two women sat on either side of him, close enough that their warmth was what he'd felt, what had pressed against him in his sleep. The one on his right, Kayla, apparently, had dark hair that fell past her shoulders in waves that caught the strange light and reflected it in shades of deep purple and blue. She wore something that looked like a dress but moved wrong, the fabric shifting and flowing as though it couldn't quite decide whether it was liquid or solid. Her face was striking, fine-boned and elegant, with eyes that held colors he couldn't name. Violet, maybe, shot through with gold. But it was her ears that made his breath catch. They swept back from her head in long, elegant points, easily twice the length of human ears, decorated with fine threads of what looked like silver growing directly from the flesh. The woman on his left, Lyra, was lighter in coloring, her hair the pale blonde of moonlight, cut shorter to frame her face. She wore something more structured, almost like armor but clearly not, all flowing lines and impossible geometry. Her eyes were lighter too, more blue than violet, dancing with barely suppressed laughter. Her ears matched her sister's, long and pointed, though her decorative threads were gold instead of silver. "I'm having a stroke," David said, surprised his voice worked. "Or a psychotic break. Probably a stroke though. I should call 911. He tried to sit up and found his body responding slowly, muscles not quite obeying the urgent commands his brain was sending. Not paralyzed, everything worked. But it felt like moving through resistance he couldn't see. Lyra laughed, the sound like bells in wind. "Oh, I like him. He goes straight to medical emergency instead of screaming." "Most humans scream first," Kayla agreed, though she didn't sound amused so much as clinically interested. "The last one we observed wouldn't stop screaming for nearly 6 minutes. It became uncomfortable." "You observed someone screaming for 6 minutes and didn't help them?" David managed to prop himself up on his elbows, looking between them. His heart was hammering, but the panic he should be feeling seemed muted, distant, like he was experiencing fear through several layers of insulation. We helped by leaving, Lyra said cheerfully. Turns out he wasn't compatible after all. Very disappointing. We'd been visiting his dreams for weeks. David's brain snagged on that phrase. Dreams. He had a sudden, vivid flash of memory, nights of half-remembered conversations, of presences in his sleep that had made him feel less alone. He'd attributed it to stress, to the loneliness of living by himself in a job where he spent most nights monitoring radio signals from space that never said anything interesting. But now the memories were sharpening, coming into focus like photographs developing. Warm voices in the dark. Gentle touches. A sense of being watched over, protected. Conversations about everything and nothing, his work, his life, his habit of naming the stars he monitored after his favorite foods because nobody else was listening anyway. You've been in my head, he said slowly, and it wasn't a question. Kayla nodded, looking pleased that he'd made the connection so quickly. For approximately 4 months, 17 days. Though, in your head, isn't quite accurate. We've been touching the edges of your consciousness, learning your patterns, letting you become accustomed to our presence. The full connection only happened last night. During the third moon, Lyra added, as if that explained everything. When David just stared at her, she grinned. Sorry. That probably doesn't translate well. It's more like, during optimal resonance conditions. When the barriers between minds are thinnest. David looked around the room, really looked this time. It was roughly the size of his bedroom but bore no other resemblance. The walls had the same quality as the ceiling, smooth, seamless, glowing faintly. There was furniture, if you could call it that. The surface he was lying on was more like a platform that had grown organically from the floor, covered in material that felt like silk and clouds had a child. There were no visible doors, no windows except the transparent sections of ceiling. No outlets, no light switches, no signs of any technology he recognized. I'm on a spaceship, he said, testing the words. They sounded absurd spoken aloud. Technically, you're on a vessel, Kayla corrected. Spaceship implies a craft that moves through space. We move space around us. Slight but important distinction. Oh, well, that clears everything up then. David swung his legs over the side of the platform, bed, he'd call it a bed to maintain some sense of normalcy, and was relieved to find the floor solid under his bare feet. He was still wearing his pajamas, he noticed. The old flannel pants with the cartoon robots and the faded university t-shirt he'd gotten freshman year. Somehow, that was more embarrassing than waking up between two alien women. So let me get this straight. You've been stalking me in my dreams for months, you've kidnapped me, and now I'm on a spaceship that doesn't move through space. Does that about cover it? You're leaving out the best part, Lyra said, standing in one fluid motion. She was taller than he'd expected, easily matching his 6 feet. You belong to us now. The choosing is complete. David's legs gave out approximately 3 seconds after Lyra said he belonged to them. Not from fear, exactly, but from the sudden realization that his entire understanding of reality had just been folded into origami and set on fire. He sat back down on the bed platform thing with more force than he'd intended, and the surface rippled under him like water, adjusting to cushion his fall. That was dramatic, Lyra observed, tilting her head in a way that made her long ears catch the light. Though not as dramatic as the screaming man. You're doing great, comparatively. Low bar, David muttered, pressing his palms against his eyes. When he opened them again, both women were still there, still impossibly beautiful and alien, still looking at him with expressions that mixed concern with something that might have been fondness. His brain tried to categorize what he was feeling and came up with an error message. Okay. Okay. I need you to explain the belonging thing because that sounds deeply concerning from a consent perspective. Kayla moved closer, not sitting beside him but kneeling on the floor so she could look up at his face. The gesture felt deliberately non-threatening, and David appreciated it even as he noted she was treating him like a spooked animal. The choosing is our oldest tradition, she said, her voice taking on a quality that suggested she was translating concepts that didn't fit neatly into English. Every generation, certain families among my people, the Ethran, seek out compatible minds across the stars. We find those whose neural patterns harmonize with our own, whose consciousness resonates at frequencies that complement rather than clash. You're talking about brains like their radio signals, David said, and then stopped because that was actually his job, sort of. He spent 40 hours a week monitoring deep space transmissions, analyzing wave patterns and frequency modulations. The irony wasn't lost on him. Close enough, Lyra said, dropping to sit cross-legged on the floor beside her sister. Together, they looked like they were about to tell him a campfire story, except the fire was invisible and the camp was apparently a spaceship that bent physics. Think of it like this. Everyone produces a kind of mental broadcast, a signature that radiates outward on frequencies most beings can't perceive. We can. And we've been listening to yours for years, David Reeves. You're loud, in the best way. David laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. I'm loud. My mental broadcast is loud. I live alone, work alone, and have exactly 3 friends who I see twice a year. But sure, I'm broadcasting loudly into space. Loneliness has a frequency, Kayla said quietly. So does longing. And intelligence, curiosity, humor, kindness. You might live alone, but your mind never stops reaching outward, asking questions, looking for connection. We heard you. We answered. The weight of that settled over David like a blanket. They'd heard him. Actually heard him. All those nights he'd stared at his monitors, hoping the universe might say something back, and it turned out something had been listening all along. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like a door opening in a wall he hadn't known was there. So you've been visiting my dreams, he said, choosing his words carefully. Learning about me. And last night you decided to, what, level up? Unlock the premium features. Lyra snorted, a sound so unexpected and human that it made David smile despite everything. Premium features. I'm using that. Yes, essentially. The dream touching is the first stage. It lets us determine true compatibility, build familiarity. But the actual bond requires bringing you here, to our space, where the barriers are thin enough for full connection. And this bond, David continued, forcing himself to ask the question that felt most important. What does it mean? You said I belong to you, but that's not exactly comforting phrasing. Kayla and Lyra exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that people who know each other deeply can have. David saw something pass between them, a negotiation happening in the space of a heartbeat. Finally, Kayla spoke. We belong to each other, she said. It's not ownership. It's recognition. You were chosen because we're meant to be a triad, 3 minds that function better together than apart. Lyra and I have been bonded since we were young. We're not sisters by blood but by choice, our consciousness is linked in ways that let us share thoughts, emotions, sometimes even sensory experience. You're meant to complete that circle. David's mind immediately went to several places at once, most of them involving concepts he'd only encountered in very specific corners of the internet. His face must have shown something because Lyra started laughing, a full-body sound that made her double over. Oh, he's thinking what I think he's thinking, she gasped between laughs. Kayla, look at his face. He's gone completely red. I wasn't, David stammered, which only made Lyra laugh harder. Even Kayla was smiling now, a softer expression that made her look less like an otherworldly being and more like someone who understood how ridiculous this situation was. Yes, that's part of it, Kayla said, matter of fact. Physical bonding strengthens mental connection. But it's not the foundation. We're not collecting humans for entertainment, David. This is partnership. Family. The 3 of us against whatever comes. What comes? David latched onto that phrase, grateful for a topic change. You keep saying things like that. What's coming? The mood in the room shifted, humor draining away like water from a sink. Both women's faces became serious, and David felt something else then, a whisper at the edge of his awareness that felt like cold wind. Fear. Not his own. Theirs. Earth is about to have visitors, Lyra said quietly. Not friendly ones like us who've been quietly observing for generations. The signals your planet sends into space, all that radio and television and digital noise, it's been noticed. And not everyone who noticed is interested in gentle first contact. David's stomach dropped. He thought about his work, about the arrays pointed at the sky, listening for signals. They'd always assumed if anything found them, it would be friendly. Or at least neutral. The idea that humanity had been ringing a dinner bell into the void for decades was something out of bad science fiction. How long? He asked. Months, Kayla said. Maybe less. They're already approaching your solar system. We've been preparing, trying to establish connections with humans who can help when the time comes. People who understand both worlds. Bridges. I'm a radio technician who watches Netflix alone most nights, David said flatly. I'm not exactly ambassador material. You're ours, Lyra said, and there was steel under the playfulness now. That makes you exactly what we need. But only if you choose it. Only if you accept the bond willingly. David looked between them, these impossible women with their long ears and their star-filled eyes, offering him everything he'd never dared want and asking him to help save the world in the process. His old life felt very far away suddenly, his small apartment and smaller routine seeming like someone else's memories. What happens if I say no? He asked. We take you home, Kayla said simply. We sever the partial bond we've established. You'll remember us as dreams, nothing more. The connection will fade within days. You'll be safe. And you? Lyra's smile was sad. We'll hurt. But we'll survive. We always do. David thought about waking up alone again, going back to his monitors and his empty apartment. He thought about knowing the universe was full of life and wonder and being cut off from it by choice. He thought about these two women who'd crossed space to find him, who'd listened to his loneliness and answered it. Can I at least get some coffee before I decide the fate of humanity? He asked. The coffee, when it arrived, was blue. Not sky blue or navy blue, but a luminescent azure that seemed to glow faintly in the cup Lyra pressed into his hands. David stared at it, then up at her, then back at the liquid that was definitely not coffee despite smelling exactly like the dark roast he bought from the corner store every Sunday. This is a test, isn't it? He said. To see if I'll drink mysterious alien beverages without question. I've seen this movie. I drink this and wake up in a pod being used as a battery. That movie was wildly inaccurate, Kayla said from across the room where she was doing something with a panel that had materialized from the wall. Her fingers moved through the air, manipulating interfaces David couldn't see, pulling data streams that left brief trails of light. Human bodies are terrible batteries. The energy required to sustain you vastly exceeds what you could produce. The entire premise makes no thermodynamic sense. Thank you for that reassuring analysis of why I won't be turned into a battery, David said. Really puts my mind at ease about the glowing blue coffee. Lyra sat down beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. The contact sent a small shock through him, not painful but startling, like static electricity but warmer. She grinned at whatever expression crossed his face. It's not coffee. We don't have coffee. This is Koresh, which is close enough that your brain will accept it as coffee while your body gets the chemical compounds it's screaming for. You're experiencing withdrawal, by the way. Your hands are shaking. David looked down and realized she was right. A faint tremor ran through his fingers. He'd gone to sleep around midnight, which meant he'd missed his morning cup by several hours at least. Time felt slippery here, impossible to track. How long have I been gone? From Earth, I mean. Approximately 9 hours, Kayla said without looking up from her invisible work. Your supervisor will have received a message that you're ill. You have 3 days of sick leave accumulated, which gives us time before anyone becomes concerned. You hacked my work schedule. David took a sip of the Koresh more from spite than thirst and immediately regretted his skepticism. It tasted exactly like coffee, rich and dark with a hint of chocolate, and the warmth that spread through him had nothing to do with temperature. His headache, which he'd barely noticed building behind his eyes, evaporated. The tremor in his hands stilled. Okay, that's unsettlingly good. We've been studying humans for a long time, Lyra said, looking pleased with herself. We know what you need. Food, water, caffeine, approximately 7 to 9 hours of sleep, social connection, and cat videos. That last one confused us for years, honestly. We thought it might be a religious practice. David choked on his second sip. You think cat videos are religious? Not anymore, Kayla said, finally turning away from her work. But for a while, the data suggested Earth's dominant species might worship small predatory mammals. The amount of time and resources devoted to recording and sharing images of them seemed ritualistic. We also considered that cats might be the actual dominant species and humans their servants, Lyra added helpfully. That theory had significant support until we studied closer. David found himself laughing, real laughter that shook his shoulders and made his ribs ache. The absurdity of it all crashed over him like a wave. He was on an alien spaceship, drinking glowing blue coffee, discussing humanity's relationship with cat videos with 2 women who had ears like fantasy elves and could apparently hack his work computer from orbit. His life had become a fever dream, and the worst part was how quickly he was adjusting to it. So what now? He asked when he could breathe again. You mentioned I need to accept the bond willingly. What does that actually involve? Is there a ceremony? Do I sign something? Please tell me it's not blood magic because I faint at needles. Nothing so dramatic, Kayla said, moving to sit on his other side. Now he was flanked by both of them again, caught between their warmth and their presence, and his pulse kicked up for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The bond forms through sustained contact and mutual acceptance. Physical touch helps, which is why we've been staying close. But the final step requires intent. You have to want it, consciously and clearly, and speak the words that open your mind fully to ours. Words in your language, I'm guessing, David said. Which I don't speak. You'd be surprised, Lyra said. She reached out and tapped his temple gently. We've been teaching you in your sleep. The vocabulary is there, buried in your subconscious. You just need to pull it forward. David wanted to argue that you couldn't learn a language unconsciously, but then again, he was drinking alien coffee on a ship that folded space, so maybe linguistic impossibilities were off the table. He closed his eyes, trying to feel for these supposedly buried words, and found them almost immediately. They sat in his mind like stones at the bottom of a clear stream, foreign but accessible. He could almost taste them on his tongue. What do they mean? He asked, eyes still closed. The words I'd have to say. Roughly translated, I open my edges to yours. I choose connection over isolation. What was separate becomes whole. Kayla's voice was soft, almost reverent. It's a promise and a prayer. We'd say them too, the 3 of us together. David opened his eyes and found both women watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. There was hope there, yes, but also vulnerability. They were offering him everything, partnership, purpose, belonging, and making themselves defenseless in the process. He could reject them. Walk away. They'd already said they'd let him go. But his apartment felt like a memory from someone else's life. The thought of going back to those empty rooms, to nights spent listening to cosmic static and pretending he didn't notice how quiet everything was, made his chest tight with something like grief. Before I decide, he said carefully, I need to understand what I'm deciding. You said Earth is in danger. That things are coming. Tell me more about that. Tell me what you need me for, specifically. The sisters exchanged another of their wordless glances. Lyra spoke first. Humanity is about to learn it's not alone in the universe. When that happens, there will be panic. Fear. And fear makes people do stupid things. We need humans who can stand between your people and ours, who can translate not just words but intentions. Who can help both sides see each other as people rather than threats or opportunities. You make it sound simple, David said. It won't be. No, Kayla agreed. It will be messy and complicated and probably involve a lot of screaming. But having someone who belongs to both worlds, who has family on both sides of the divide, that's worth everything. You'd be our anchor to humanity. Our bridge. Your insurance policy, David finished. If I'm bonded to you, hurting humans means hurting someone you love. It makes you invested in our survival. Yes, Lyra said bluntly. But also, we like you. We've been watching you long enough to know you're kind and funny and smarter than you give yourself credit for. We want you here because of who you are, not just what you represent. David drained the last of his Koresh and set the cup aside. His hands were steady now, his mind clearer than it had been in months. Maybe years. He thought about his parents, dead since he was 20. His few friends scattered across the country, their relationships maintained through occasional texts and likes on social media. His job, which paid the bills but hadn't excited him in years. There was nothing tying him to his old life except inertia and fear of change. And here were two impossible women offering him the stars. What happens after, he asked. After the bond is complete. Do I stay here? Go back to Earth? Split my time between worlds? That depends on what you want, Kayla said. And what becomes necessary. The bond doesn't require physical proximity once established. We could be systems apart and still feel each other. David spent the next several hours learning how to exist in a space that defied every assumption he'd made about physics. The vessel, as Kayla insisted on calling it, responded to intention as much as action. Doors appeared when you needed them and dissolved when you didn't. The temperature adjusted to comfort without thermostats. And the bathroom, when Lyra finally showed him where it was after he'd been too embarrassed to ask, somehow understood what you needed it to be. I'm not going to ask how the toilet knows, David said, standing in the doorway of the small chamber that had materialized from what had been a blank wall. I'm just going to accept it and move on with my life. Probably wise, Lyra agreed. Kayla once spent 6 hours trying to explain the mechanics to a potential candidate. He chose to go home before she finished. She was very disappointed. I don't get disappointed, Kayla called from somewhere else in the vessel. I get scientifically frustrated by the inability to convey complex concepts across linguistic and educational barriers. That's literally what disappointment is, Lyra shouted back, then grinned at David. She gets very intense about plumbing. It's adorable. David discovered he was starving around what his body insisted was early afternoon. Lyra led him to what she called the sustenance chamber, which turned out to be less a kitchen and more a room filled with panels that produced food when you touched them. Or thought at them. David wasn't entirely clear on the mechanism. Think of something you'd like to eat, Lyra instructed, pulling a tray from a panel that hadn't been there a moment before. On it sat something that looked like fruit but moved slightly, as if breathing. She bit into it without hesitation, juice running down her chin. David stared at the panels, his mind unhelpfully blank except for the observation that he was being asked to manifest food through force of will. What if I think of something you don't have? Like, I don't know, a cheeseburger. Try it and find out. He placed his hand on the nearest panel, thought very deliberately about a cheeseburger with everything, and jerked back when the panel warmed under his palm. A tray slid out holding something that was definitely burger adjacent. The bun was too perfect, the patty had a faint iridescence, and the lettuce was more purple than green, but it smelled exactly right. David picked it up, took a cautious bite, and made an involuntary sound that he'd later deny was a moan. It tasted like the best burger he'd ever had, each flavor distinct but harmonizing, and the meat had a texture that was somehow both familiar and entirely new. "What is this?" he asked around a mouthful. "Synthesized protein matrix based on your memory of what a cheeseburger should taste like," Lyra said, watching him with obvious amusement. "Mixed with nutritional components your body is currently deficient in. You need more iron and vitamin D. Also, you're slightly dehydrated." "My burger is judging my life choices," David said, taking another bite. "This is my life now. Being nutritionally critiqued by alien food technology." They ate together in what David was learning to think of as companionable silence, though it wasn't truly silent. He could hear things, faint sounds that might have been the ship breathing or thinking or doing whatever vessels that folded space did when they weren't actively folding it. Lyra hummed something that wasn't quite a song, her long ears twitching occasionally in a way that suggested they weren't just decorative. "Can I ask about the ears?" David said finally, because the question had been building since he'd first seen them. "I mean, obviously they're ears. But they're so much longer than human ears. Do they work differently?" Lyra's ears swiveled toward him like a cat's, an independent motion that made David's brain hiccup. "They're more sensitive than yours. We can hear frequencies you can't, pick up vibrations in the air that tell us about emotional states and health. Right now, yours are telling me you're nervous but curious, tired but fighting it, and finding me attractive in a way you're trying not to think about too loudly." David choked on his burger. "That's not fair. You can't just read my emotional vibrations and call me out like that." "I could lie," Lyra offered, her expression innocent. "Pretend I don't notice that your heart rate increases when I get close or that you keep looking at Kayla when you think she's not paying attention. Would that make you more comfortable?" "Yes, actually. Lying would be great. I'm very pro-lying right now." Lyra laughed and reached over to steal one of his fries, which were actually some kind of root vegetable but close enough. "You're going to have to get used to transparency, David. The bond will make you even more obvious to us. We'll know what you're feeling before you do sometimes. There's no hiding." The thought should have been terrifying. David had spent most of his adult life carefully maintaining walls, keeping people at a safe distance where they couldn't see how lonely he was or how much he wanted connection he was too afraid to reach for. The idea of two people having complete access to his inner landscape made him want to run. But another part of him, the part that had been broadcasting into space hoping for an answer, found the prospect oddly comforting. No more pretending. No more carefully managed distance. Just honesty, raw and complete. "What if I'm boring?" he asked quietly. "Once you can see everything, all the mundane thoughts and stupid anxieties. What if there's nothing interesting in here worth bonding to?" Lyra's expression softened. She set down her tray and shifted closer, taking his hand. Her skin was warm, slightly cooler than human normal but not unpleasantly so. "David, we've been listening to you for months. We know about your boring thoughts. We know you name stars after sandwiches and sing off-key in the shower and have conversations with the spider that lives in your bathroom corner. We know you're afraid of being forgotten and that you cry at movies about dogs and that you once spent 40 minutes researching how to help a bird that flew into your window. We know you, and we chose you anyway. Boring would be a relief, honestly. You're exhausting in the best possible way." "I don't sing that off-key," David protested weakly, but his throat was tight with something that might have been emotion. "And I had to research the bird thing. I didn't know if it was okay to pick it up." "The bird was fine, and you sang it a song while it recovered," Lyra said. "It was objectively off-key and absolutely charming." Kayla cried. "I did not cry," Kayla said, appearing in the doorway with impeccable timing. "My eyes watered due to atmospheric conditions on the observation deck." "You were moved by his kindness and you know it," Lyra shot back. Kayla moved into the room with that same fluid grace they both had, settling onto a bench across from David. "Perhaps." He also sang a Jason Mraz song to a stunned bird, which suggested either deep compassion or a minor break from reality. We found both options appealing. David buried his face in his hands. You watched me sing to a bird. You've been watching me this whole time and you still want me here. I'm not sure if that's romantic or deeply concerning. Both, the sisters said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. The sound of their shared laughter did something to the knot of anxiety in David's chest, loosening it until he could breathe easier. They weren't perfect mysterious aliens on pedestals. They were people, strange and wonderful and clearly as uncertain about this as he was. They'd taken a risk coming for him, opened themselves to potential rejection. And they'd done it because they believed he was worth it. Maybe it was time to believe that too. Okay, David said, looking up. Okay. I want to try. The bond thing. I want to say yes. But I need to know what happens if it doesn't work. If we do this ritual or whatever and it turns out we're not actually compatible. What then? Kayla's expression became serious. Then we'll know immediately. The connection either forms or it doesn't. If it doesn't, there's no harm done beyond disappointment. We take you home, we remain friends if you wish, and we continue searching. And if it does work? Then everything changes, Lyra said simply. For all of us. They prepared him as best they could, though Kayla admitted there wasn't much preparation needed beyond understanding and willingness. The bonding chamber, when they finally led him there, turned out to be the same room where he'd first awakened. The bed platform had shifted configuration, forming a circle large enough for 3 people to sit facing each other with their knees almost touching. Should I be wearing something special? David asked, looking down at his robot pajamas. This feels like an occasion that requires better pants. Your pants are perfect, Lyra assured him, already settling into her position on the circle. We've bonded people in formal robes, in nothing at all, in full environmental suits once because they were extremely paranoid about alien contamination. The clothing doesn't matter. Only the intent. Kayla took her place opposite Lyra, leaving a space between them for David. He sat, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that felt like it should be accompanied by dramatic music. Above them, the transparent ceiling showed that impossible star field, constellations he'd never learned wheeling in their perfect patterns. I'm going to mess this up, he said. I'm going to say the words wrong or think the wrong thing or accidentally bond us to my subconscious anxiety about whether I left the stove on. You don't have a stove, Lyra pointed out. You have a hot plate that you've used twice in 6 months, both times to make ramen. You really have been watching everything, David muttered, but he was smiling despite his nerves. Okay. What do I do? Kayla reached out, taking his left hand. Lyra took his right. Their fingers laced with his, warm and solid and real. Close your eyes, Kayla instructed. Feel for those words we taught you. Don't force them. Let them surface naturally. David closed his eyes and immediately his mind started racing. He thought about his apartment, his job, his old life that felt like it belonged to someone else. He thought about loneliness and how it had become so normal he'd stopped noticing it most days. He thought about these 2 impossible women who'd reached across space because they'd heard him broadcasting his isolation into the void and decided to answer. The words rose up from somewhere deep, syllables that felt alien on his tongue but right in his chest. He spoke them haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. Shultera ven mar. Kishan nal vora. Shin kelmar ventash. I open my edges to yours. I choose connection over isolation. What was separate becomes whole. Kayla and Lyra spoke the same words, their voices harmonizing in ways that made the air shimmer. David felt something shift, like a door opening inside his mind that he hadn't known existed. Warmth flooded through him, not physical heat but something deeper, a presence that was suddenly there in the spaces where he'd always been alone. He could feel them. Not their thoughts exactly, but their emotions, their essence. Kayla's steady strength like bedrock, her curiosity that never stopped reaching for understanding. Lyra's bright joy threaded with determination, her laughter that hid steel underneath. And they could feel him, he realized. All his doubts and hopes and the fierce longing he'd carried for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. The sensation built until David couldn't tell where he ended and they began, 3 separate streams flowing into one river. It should have been overwhelming, a loss of self that ought to terrify him. Instead it felt like finally being seen completely and not having to hide anything. Then, just as suddenly as it had built, the intensity settled. The door in his mind remained open but the flood became a gentle current. He was still himself, still David, but now he carried them with him. 2 additional heartbeats in harmony with his own. 2 presences that would never leave him alone again. He opened his eyes and found them watching him with expressions of wonder that probably matched his own. Lyra was crying, silver tears tracking down her face. Kayla's hand trembled in his, though her smile was radiant. "Holy shit," David whispered. "Is it always like that?" "No," Kayla said, her voice rough. "That was extraordinary. The connection is so clear, so strong. I can feel your joy and it's amplifying mine and feeding back." And she stopped, laughing helplessly. "You're making us giddy." "I'm making you giddy." David could feel what she meant though, the feedback loop of emotion bouncing between the 3 of them, building like audio feedback but pleasant, warm, right. "This is amazing. This is absolutely insane but amazing. Can you hear my thoughts? Because I'm thinking some things I'd rather keep private, Anne." "We can feel the shape of your thoughts but not read them word for word," Lyra said, wiping her eyes. "Though right now you're projecting pretty loudly and yes, we find you attractive too, and yes, we'll address that later, and no, you don't need to be embarrassed." David's face burned. "The no privacy thing is going to take getting used to." "You'll learn to modulate," Kayla assured him. "Think of it like volume control. Right now everything is turned up because the bond is new. It'll settle." They sat there for a while, hands linked, adjusting to the new reality of being 3 instead of separate. David experimented with the connection, learning he could push feelings toward them deliberately or pull back to give them space. It was like learning a new language, one spoken entirely in emotion and sensation. Finally, reluctantly, Lyra broke the physical connection and stood. "We should show you the observation deck properly. You need to see Earth from here. Understand what we're protecting." The observation deck was a room David hadn't seen yet, a bubble of transparent material that jutted from the vessel's side. Standing in it felt like floating in space, stars above and below, and there, small and blue and impossibly beautiful, hung Earth. David's breath caught. He'd seen pictures, of course. Everyone had seen pictures of Earth from space. But this was different. This was real and immediate and right there, his entire world small enough to cover with his thumb. "Everyone I've ever known is down there," he said quietly. "Everything I've ever been. And now you're more," Lyra said, moving to stand beside him. Kayla took his other side, and David felt their presence in his mind, steady and sure. "You're the bridge between them and us. Between isolation and connection." "No pressure though," David said, but he was smiling. Through the bond, he could feel their confidence in him, their certainty that he was capable of this. It helped quiet the doubt that wanted to rise up. "So what happens now?" "We wait for the other aliens to show up and I play diplomat." "Eventually," Kayla said. "First, you need training. Language, culture, politics, technology. We have a few months before first contact becomes inevitable. We'll use that time to prepare you. And you'll need to go back to Earth periodically," Lyra added. "Maintain your cover, keep your life there intact. You're no good as a bridge if you're completely disconnected from humanity." David thought about his apartment, his job, his small life. It was still there, waiting for him. But it would never be the same. He'd never be the same. He'd touched the stars and bonded his soul to two alien women who'd heard his loneliness singing into space and decided to answer it. "My supervisor is going to wonder why I'm suddenly so happy," he said. "I'm usually the grumpy guy who brings terrible coffee and complains about the equipment." "Tell him you met someone," Lyra suggested, her eyes dancing. "It's not even a lie." "Someone plural," David corrected. "And that's definitely going to raise questions I'm not prepared to answer." He could feel their laughter through the bond before he heard it, a sensation like champagne bubbles in his chest. His own laughter joined theirs, echoing in the observation bubble while Earth turned slowly below them, unaware that one of its children had just chosen the stars. The future was uncertain. First contact loomed like a storm on the horizon, bringing changes David couldn't begin to imagine. But standing between Kayla and Lyra, feeling their presence wound through his mind like golden threads, he found he wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Three minds that worked better as one. Three hearts beating in harmony. A bridge between worlds, built from loneliness that had finally, miraculously, found its answer. David Reeves belonged to them now, and they to him, and that belonging felt like the first true home he'd ever known.